Okay, here's our final tutorial on dealing with some of the tricky logical relationships that need to be translated into symbolic logic. Okay, the two things we're going to talk about right now are necessary condition and sufficient condition. Okay, we can relate things through the concepts of necessary condition and sufficient condition. What do they mean? When we say that one thing is a necessary condition for something else, we're saying that it's needed for that other thing. So for example, if I were to say that passing this course, Art of Thinking, is a necessary condition for graduating Sacred Heart, you'd understand what that meant, right? You need to pass this course in order to graduate. Now notice when I say that passing the course is a necessary condition for graduating Sacred Heart, that doesn't mean that if you pass the course, you graduate, right? I'm not saying that it's enough to graduate. I'm just saying that it's necessary to graduate. Okay, so passing Art of Thinking is a necessary condition for graduating Sacred Heart University. Similarly, being a Sacred Heart student is a necessary condition for being a Sacred Heart athlete. In other words, you need to be a Sacred Heart student to be a Sacred Heart athlete. Now again, simply being a student isn't enough, right? You could be a Sacred Heart student, you could go out for the basketball team and not make it. So just because you're a Sacred Heart student doesn't make you a Sacred Heart athlete. Just because you've passed this course doesn't mean you've graduated Sacred Heart. You could pass this course and you could go on to another school, you could pass this course and do something else, right? So when we say that one thing is a necessary condition for something else, we're saying that it's needed for that something else. But it certainly doesn't guarantee that something else. Now, when we want to guarantee something, we use the concept of sufficient condition. Take a look at this example. To say that someone is a New York Yankee is a sufficient condition of them being a pro athlete, that probably makes sense to you, right? If someone's a New York Yankee, that's sufficient for them being a pro athlete. Why? Because sufficient means it's enough, right? If you're on the Yankees, that's enough to make you a pro athlete, right? Unlike here, where we said passing Art of Thinking is not enough for graduating Sacred Heart, being a New York Yankee is enough to make you a pro athlete. Likewise, drinking a 12-pack, that's enough, that's sufficient for getting drunk, right? Or it should be. If it's not, you probably need to talk to someone, right? Drinking a 12-pack is a sufficient condition for getting drunk, right? Which is to say that if you drink a 12-pack, then you will get drunk. But just like here, these necessary conditions were not sufficient for these things. In these examples, these sufficient conditions are not necessary. Being a New York Yankee is not necessary for being a professional athlete. Drinking a 12-pack is not necessary for getting drunk, right? You could be a Boston Red Sox and you are a pro athlete, okay? You could drink a bottle of vodka and you'd probably be dead, but for a while there at least, you'd be drunk. In other words, that when we talk about necessary condition, we're saying that these things are necessary for these things, but we don't mean that they have to be sufficient. And right here, when we talk about sufficient condition, we're saying these things are sufficient for these things, but that doesn't make them necessary. Now, occasionally we have something that is both necessary and sufficient, and we want to express that relationship. Take a look at this example on the bottom. Winning the Super Bowl and becoming the National Football League champions, right? Winning the Super Bowl is necessary for being a champion. Okay, even if you don't know a lot about football, you might know that. Okay, winning the Super Bowl is also sufficient. If you win the Super Bowl, then you are the NFL champions, right? So sometimes we have relationships where things are both necessary and sufficient. Okay, so let's review these four things again. Passing Art of Thinking is necessary for graduating Sacred Heart, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough. Being a Sacred Heart student is necessary for being a Sacred Heart athlete, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough to make you a Sacred Heart athlete. Being a New York Yankee is sufficient for making you a pro athlete, but it's not necessary. There are other ways of being a pro athlete. Drinking a 12-pack is sufficient for getting you drunk, but it's not necessary. There are other ways to get drunk. Winning the Super Bowl is necessary and sufficient for being the NFL champ. It's necessary, there's no other way to become champ, and it's sufficient. If you win that Super Bowl, you're champ. Okay, so once you get used to these relationships and understand them a little bit, internalize them a bit, okay, the next step now is to be able to translate them. How do we translate necessary and sufficient condition into our symbolic logic, into our language of symbols, where we can use them in more complicated ways? Well, let's think about it. Passing Art of Thinking, graduating Sacred Heart. What do you think that's going to be? Is that going to be if I pass, then I graduate? Or if it's true that I've graduated, then I've passed? Right? Which one do you think it is? Well, it's the second, right? To say that passing Art of Thinking is a necessary condition of graduating, that means if it's true that you've graduated, you must have passed Art of Thinking at Sacred Heart University. So the proper translation here is exactly what we had here. G implies P. Okay, if it's true that you've graduated, it's true that you've passed Sacred Heart University. Okay, to be a Sacred Heart student is a necessary condition for being a Sacred Heart athlete. That means if one is a Sacred Heart athlete, you know they have to be a Sacred Heart student. If someone is a Sacred Heart athlete, you know something about them. If they are a Sacred Heart athlete, then they must be a Sacred Heart student. Okay? Notice that the reverse of these things would not be true. It would not be true to say if you pass Art of Thinking, then you graduate Sacred Heart. That's not true. It would not be true to say that if you are a Sacred Heart student, then you are a Sacred Heart athlete. That's clearly not true. Okay, now how about sufficient relation? Being a New York Yankee is sufficient for being a pro athlete. Okay, well, this one is probably a little simpler. If you are a New York Yankee, then you are a pro athlete. Drinking a 12-pack, getting drunk. Well, if you drink a 12-pack, then you get drunk. Right? So when we're talking about sufficient condition, it's simpler, it's more intuitive. We're saying that if the first thing is true, the second thing must be true. Okay? Notice again, the opposite wouldn't be the case. Just because someone's an athlete wouldn't make them a Yankee. Okay? Just because someone is drunk doesn't mean they necessarily had a 12-pack. So if we reverse these, you would see that they were false, whereas these are true. And then finally, winning the Super Bowl and being NFL champs. Okay, well, this means that we've said that this is necessary and sufficient condition. Okay, and in order to express that relationship, we use the equivalent sign, 3 bars. Okay, what that basically means is that these two things will be true together, or these two things will be false together. Okay, if you've won the Super Bowl, you are the NFL champ. If you are the NFL champ, you've won the Super Bowl. Okay? They have to be true together, or they have to be false together. Okay? If you've lost the Super Bowl, you're not the champ. If you're not the champ, you've lost the Super Bowl. Okay, so that's the last of it. Okay? We started pretty simple. We've built up to some fairly complicated relationships, and now we can put them all together. This is going to take time. All right? That's why it's so important to do this little by little. Okay? So our only task for this week, our only task is translation. To get used to translating from the English language into symbolic logic, practice, practice, practice. You will find yourself getting better. Practice, take time off, come back, practice again, take time off. Okay, remember the athlete who works 10 hours before the day of the race is in a lot of trouble. The athlete that works 2 hours a day before a race has got a chance of doing well. Okay, good luck.